Let's talk about the Safavid Empire now. This one was located in between the Ottoman Empire and the Mughal Empire. So as this loads, we'll look at a map. So the Ottoman Empire, as we know, is here. The Indian Mughal Empire is here. So it's sandwiched right in between these two. So the center Gunpowder Empire. The Safavid Empire had a couple of problems, so it didn't last nearly as long as the Ottoman Empire to the west. One of the problems was, despite the fact that it had a location on the sea, on the Arabian Sea and the Persian Gulf, it never had a strong navy, so that's going to leave it very weak in terms of a military sense. And also it doesn't really have any natural defenses. It's not located on a mountain range. You know, there are these different water connections to it. So we'll see that it also declines because they can't really defend themselves. But nonetheless, because they also use gunpowder in the 1500s, they are going to rise to power. And they do have strong leadership in their early years. So one prominent example of a strong leader was was Ishmael, who was the major conqueror who consolidates the territory that makes up the Safavid Empire. He had, just like we said, characteristics of people who made up the Gunpowder Empires. They're not quite sure what his ethnicity was. He was definitely from a Turkish background, but he could have come from a number of different places. But nonetheless, he was a military hero, and he conquered much of Persia and then pushed into Iraq. And by the time he was 14 or 15, he had conquered all of Iran, so he basically consolidated the Safavid Empire. And then he was proclaimed Shah, which was the word for king or emperor in the Safavid Empire. And that happened in 1501. And one of the other distinguishing characteristics of the Safavid Empire was that it was much more strict in terms of religion. It was Shia, which is a huge difference between that and the Ottoman Empire to the west and the Mughal Empire to the east. The Ottomans and Mughals were more Sunni in nature. So Ismail decides to build a power base in his capital that denies legitimacy to any Sunnis. So that sort of resistance to Sunnis is going to cause a lot of hostility with the Ottomans. And this is one of the reasons why the Safavids become weaker eventually. They also are weaker because they don't have as strong of a military as the Ottomans. So, for example, the Safavids were trying to extend a little bit farther west. They got as far as this location here. This is a city called Tabriz, and they were stopped there. So basically, this is a modern map, but you see this city marked the real border between the Sunni and Shia societies. So the Safavids were not able to extend any further west. But also it's important to acknowledge that not all of the conflicts between the Ottomans and the Safavids were religious in nature. They also just conflicted over overland trade routes. And what's important is the fact that these two empires are in conflict with one another means that they're not as big of a threat to Europe as they could have been if they had sort of joined forces. The next and most powerful Shah of the Safavid Empire was Abbas the Great. He ruled from 1587 to 1629. He made sure that the army of the Safavid Empire was very powerful, and so he conscripted troops into the military in a very similar way that the Janissaries were recruited in the Ottoman Empire. So basically, the Safavids also were going to take soldiers who were Christian boys, many of them from far away Western Christian territories, so places as far west as the state of Georgia and Russia, and they would force them to join the military. You also saw that they were adopting some European military technology, so they imported weapons from Europe, and they also used Europeans to help teach them how to use these weapons. So again, the gunpowder age could not have been successful if it wasn't for the adaptation of these modern military technologies. And as time goes on, when the Safavid Empire becomes centralized, the Shahs are going to start to control not only the government, but they also control the religion itself. And the Safavid Empire is a very good example of a theocracy. The Shahs are going to use Shia practices to back up their legitimacy. And this theocratic government represents continuity because the present day state of Iran is still a theocratic government. So you see some synthesis there that you can apply to the present day. Shah Abbas was well known for beautifying his cities. The capital of the Safavid Empire was Isfahan, which is located south of the present-day capital, Tehran. One of the major things that he did was he added very broad avenues to the city's parks. He planted trees, and he built numerous mosques and schools throughout the major cities. He also was encouraging of the production of beautiful crafts. It is thought, though, that the Safavids were not as invested in craft production as some of their other neighbors to the east and west. So the Mughals and the Ottomans actually had more craftsmen than the Safavids did, but nonetheless, they did certainly have some notable contributions to the arts here, and these are beautiful examples of some craftsmanship from the Safavid Empire. The Safavid Empire also had an economic connection with Europe, notably Portugal, and then later Great Britain. So at the establishment of the Safavid Empire, the Portuguese are still very frequently trading with India. And the Portuguese actually, at the beginning of the Safavid Empire, occupied this little waterway, which was called the Strait of Hormuz. And this is a vital connection between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Osman, which eventually dumps out into the Indian Ocean. But the Safavids wanted to take control of this waterway. They didn't want the Portuguese to have it. So they actually solicit the help of the British to do this. And in 1622, Abbas actually wins control of the strait because English people lend some of their ships to the Safavids. And because the British helped the Safavids, this begins a very long-term British investment in Iran, which is another very good example of synthesis and continuity and change. The Safavids, again, don't last nearly as long as the Ottomans, though. One of the reasons why they start to decline is because Abbas represents the pinnacle of centralized rule, and the leaders that succeed him are not nearly as effective. They live a more lavish lifestyle, they overspend, and revenues begin to decline. The weakened economy means that they cannot keep the military up significantly, and as we already discussed, the Safavid Empire doesn't have a very strong defensive location, and they don't have a navy. So if their economy is doing poorly and they can't invest in the military anymore, they're going to be more prone to invasion. Also, you're going to see that the fact that they're not religiously tolerant contributes to their decline. There's going to be a rebellion called the Pashtun Rebellion in 1722. This was led by a group of Sunnis who were coming from Afghanistan, or modern-day Afghanistan. And so they rise up against the Safavid Shia government. The Safavids are not able to stop the uprising, and the Afghan forces actually sack the capital at Isfahan. Mahmud, who was their leader, declared himself to be the new Shah of Persia. And this does not mark the absolute end of the Safavid dynasty. They continue to rule nominally, but after the Pashtun Rebellion, the Safavids never again are centralized. There's going to be a lot of resulting chaos. So the Safavids, because they cannot be centralized, because they can't collect taxes effectively anymore, they're going to decline pretty rapidly after that. And because they are weaker in a military sense, also their neighbors, the Ottomans to the west and the Russians to the north, are going to take advantage of that weakened military and start seizing territory from the Safavids. The Safavid dynasty will be replaced by the Zand dynasty by 1760. But nonetheless, one other thing I just wanted to say actually briefly here is that even though the Safavids lose their centralization, Isfahan continues to be a very significant city to the region. It still is a very good example of architectural achievement. It's a beautiful city with gardens, fountains, pools. It was seen as a very inviting place in contrast to the harsh countryside outside of the cities, which was very desert-like in climate. And the gardens and the rest of the cities were acclaimed even by Westerners as, just a very beautiful example of the architectural achievements of these Middle Eastern empires. Lastly, it's important for us to talk about the differences in the women in the Safavid Empire compared to the Ottoman Empire that we just discussed. Okay, so the Safavid women, by contrast, are in a much more restricted position in society. They were required to be veiled, and they were also restricted in their movements. They had very little access to rights, so it was very rare that they could seek out a divorce. Some Islamic law did provide for them limited divorce and occasionally land inheritance, but again, it was still very limited. And also in historical documents, women are barely mentioned. So it gives you a clear sense that women do not have nearly as prominent of a role in the Safavid Empire as they did in the Ottoman Empire, where we discussed harem politics at length. So that does it for the Safavid dynasty. It is much more short-lived, as we could see. We will finish with one more video on the Mughal Empire in India, so stay tuned for that. Thanks.